I'm Esther Dillard on the Black Information Network, chatting with writers and authors who offer an added perspective for our listeners. This is The Color Between the Lines. In this edition of Color Between the Lines, we're talking about a book that addresses a lot of what is happening in many Black and brown neighborhoods across the country. It's sometimes called gentrification, or the character of an urban area that's being changed by wealthier people moving in. But what that definition often doesn't include is that it's pushing out a lot of poorer people out of their neighborhood. Our next author wrote a fiction about this subject. It's called There Goes the Neighborhood. She artfully addresses the issue of two young readers about three friends who fight the gentrification of their South Los Angeles neighborhood by faking gang activity on social media. Their plan takes a serious turn when someone gets killed. The author is Jade Adia. She holds a bachelor's degree in ethnicity, race, and migration, and a certificate in human rights. She's also a recent law school graduate with a specialization in critical race studies. There Goes the Neighborhood is her debut novel. Welcome, Jade, to the BIN.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Oh, thank you for joining us. My understanding is that you started this novel during the start of the pandemic. Was that the sole inspiration for this story, or was there some other things that were factored in?
Yeah, I mean, it was a little bit of things all coming together at one time. So I wrote the book during the summer of 2020, which we all remember as that very tumultuous, emotional summer with the Black Lives Matter uprisings and the pandemic also facing us at the same time. So part of me was sitting down and trying to think about how I can have a sort of creative escape from everything that was going on. I hadn't written books ever before that summer, but I found myself wanting to get lost in a really long project. So that was brewing on one end. And then on the other end, I was, when not quarantined at home with my family, I was going out to these protests, and I was seeing and being really inspired by just how, like, the energy that the younger protesters were bringing to those spaces, the teenagers, the Gen Z protesters, where I had never been in a space like that before, where there were kids who were there and talking and speaking, but also they brought Bluetooth speakers and they were dancing, and there was a lot of joy and a lot of community building as well. And so I think when I decided to really open a Word doc and sit down and write something, I was really thinking about those teenagers at the front of my mind and thinking about their creativity, and tried to, rise to the challenge of, like, how can I tell a story that deals with serious issues that impact our communities and doesn't shy away from the harsh political truths, but that there's also room for joy and laughter and, like, the essence of, like, those coming of age experiences too.
I love how you weave so many interesting details into the neighborhood or on the setting of this story. And you talk about the tensions between new people moving in, rent going up, folks that have been in their neighborhood for years and being pushed out. Can you talk about where you pulled all these details from? Was it personal things or from things that you read in the news?
Yeah, I mean, it was a little bit of both. I mean, so in terms of, like, the depictions of gentrification, I think for me, it was really when I went away to college and came back home for the first time that I really started seeing gentrification really starting to change where I grew up, where obviously it had been happening on some level for a while, but this type of accelerated gentrification that we're seeing in LA, but in cities all across America, I wasn't really feeling that way about my home until I went away for a year and came back. And every year for those 4 years, more and more places where I used to hang out as a kid were going away, more and more luxury high rises showing up, some billboards about up and coming neighborhoods. And I was like, oh, wow, what's happening now is different. This is something that's deliberate and intentional, and it's coming in fast. So some of it was kind of that experience of coming back home during those college years. And then some of it was also just, when I was in law school, I spent a lot of time focusing on, everything from like local government law to affordable housing policy. And I was feeling I felt myself gravitated towards the people that were going out of their way to bring gentrification into these conversations, because I feel like sometimes people aren't really, I don't know, for whatever reason, I think when people are thinking of gentrification, they're not seeing it as like current history in the way that I think it is, where like this is on the level of redlining, this is on the level of segregation, like gentrification, and the resegregation that's happening and the exclusion and displacement of our communities should be spoken about with that same level of intensity. So some of it was also coming from that realm of my academic life as well.
Raya, she's a very, very powerful voice in this. She is the voice of the novel, and she has a lot of sort of anger about this whole change that's going on. Was that reflected, some of the anger that maybe you may have felt in coming home and seeing all those changes happening?
Oh yeah, definitely. I think, when I sat down to write, I knew that I wanted to have a really nuanced portrait of Black girlhood, which I think we don't always get all the time. There are tons of people doing it really well, but um, yeah, I wanted to have a young girl who is full of rage, because I also remembered feeling, I still feel that way now, but that's especially how I felt as a teenager, where that feeling of lack of control and instability, both in your life and your home and then the world around you, it's a lot to deal with. And then on top of that, you have to deal with everything else that comes from being a Black girl in this country. And then there's all of these other changes happening as well, where with the main character in the book, she's seeing her neighborhood change, she's seeing her friend group change as some new gentrifiers come into the neighborhood but kind of catch the eyes of her friends, and
Yeah.
she's feeling her own relationships change, her feelings about her childhood best friend. It's just stacked on top of each other. So it was important to me to have a girl that was angry, but also deeply nerdy and wholesome. But really, at her core, it's just that fear of change that I think a lot of us can relate to at that age of 15.
I love the age that I love the age that you use, the mix of different things that she was dealing with. Zeke and Malachi, their different personalities and all the different characters that you put in there. And the fact that they devise a scheme to stick together because one of them is going to be forced out of the neighborhood. And their solution seems so very simple, but really believable in today's day and age. What did you hope that young readers would take away from, they fought back to keep their neighborhood intact. How, if they're facing a similar issue, I guess, what's the message that you wanted them to take away from it when they were reading it?
Yeah, I mean, definitely, as I've been as I've been meeting teen readers recently, I've been sure to say, these characters have the best intentions but not the best solutions. So I'm like, please read the book to understand that their plan doesn't work. But one thing that I hope they take away is that I think a lot of teenagers today are feeling this level of disillusionment about the world, where they've seen so much happen in their lives and kind of having this feeling of like, I don't trust these systems to take care of us anymore. And I think those feelings are really valid. And I hope that in the book, they can kind of see these characters who feel the same way as them as they're trying to figure out what resistance looks like to them. And I think for me, one of the big takeaways is there's so much that you can do at the local level in your community, where it's amazing to get involved civically at any level of politics in this country. But when you're thinking about like everything from like your neighborhood, your day-to-day life, there is so much room for young people to get involved at the grassroots level. And I think that these issues about gentrification and, there's some issues of policing that come up as well in the book. These are things that young people can start getting involved with early. And I think part of spending a lot of time building out an ensemble cast that's really connected to this community was to show that, there is room to grow if you like ground your roots into where you are, you know, and there's a lot of optimism that we can still have about, yeah, caring about where you are and being involved, getting to know your neighbors. And yeah, like we're not all as powerless as we might seem sometimes in this era.
Wow. For those of you who are just joining us, I'm Esther Dillard, and I'm speaking with author Jade Adia about her book, There Goes the Neighborhood. The novel has been called A Raised Fist Against the Forces of Gentrification. But how would you describe it?
Man, that's a great question. I think you know, I do appreciate the raised fist against force of gentrification metaphor because, you know, when I think of a raised fist, I think about subversion. I think like in the Black community, that's a gesture that's meant to simultaneously like challenge the status quo while also kind of like bringing our community together as a uniting image. So I do like that, but um not even a but, I like that. And I also think that it's really more, I think of it much more as a love letter to communities of color, because I think that at the core of the book, it's a really tender coming of age story about this girl and her friends and the people that make her feel safe around her. So I love the raised fist, but I also love the idea of just a very sweet love letter to like communities of color who are kind of, you know, like surviving and thriving despite it all these days.
Yeah. You know, it's interesting that you said that because I was thinking about when I read this, and I had a conversation with a friend of mine, and we were talking about how community is so important, and because you don't call the police on people you know.
Right.
So community builds relationships, it builds partnerships, it builds safety. And because the person who, you know, any people in your neighborhood, they're not other because they're part of your community family. So I guess when writing this book, what did you see? You know, what did you want to hopefully bleed through as some of the solutions that people need to look for when it comes to gentrification, the issue of gentrification? Because this is a really a real issue for a lot of people that are dealing with this on a daily basis.
Yeah, I love that conversation that you were having with your friend, because I think that's how I see the world as well, where you know, when I was growing up in a neighborhood that was, you know, very much like the inspiration for this book, it was a very tight-knit neighborhood where I knew all of my neighbors, where if my mom couldn't pick me up from school one day, there's another neighbor who would fill in. If my friend's family, for whatever reason, dinner wasn't able to happen at their place, open door policy, they were at our table. I could sleep over somewhere else. And even just walking around the neighborhood, I felt comforted by all of those like watchful eyes around me, because like I knew everyone and everyone knew us. And I think having that social safety net was so important for my personal development. And I tried to give my main character that same safety net, you know, in terms of understanding like why your community is worth fighting for. I think she has to feel safe similarly in that same way. And so I think exactly what you were saying before, like for me, one of the things that I tried to bleed into the story and what I think people can take away about resisting gentrification. I kind of weave in a couple different solutions from kind of like, you know, the policy level if you want to get involved there, but like really on the community level, there's a lot that we can do as well to at least, you know, at best resist, but at worst soften the blows. And I think that, you know, these ideas of mutual aid are really important about getting to know your neighbors, like setting up these systems of support and making sure that, like you said, like when it comes to policing, that there's conversations happening about, you know, community alternatives to policing. And because I think that with the way that I've experienced gentrification, and a lot of us have, it often comes with a lack of communication between old residents and new residents. And that's where I think a lot of the tension comes from. Not that everything can be solved by talking, but like you said, you're not going to call the cops in the house party next to you if you know it's your neighbor's baby shower and you're also invited. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I think that all of those things are important. And I think, yeah, for like disillusioned young kids, I hope that they can start thinking critically about that as well, where it's not a lost cause. And yeah, grounding in at home is a form of resistance in of itself as well.
Do you think that this book might be turned into a movie, or what do you think is going to happen to it next?
I would love that. That would be my dream. I think I wanted to write a story as accessible as possible, to start these conversations, not to start them, they're already happening, but to contribute to these conversations about gentrification. So if a film or a movie helps get this story out there even more and has people talking at their dinner tables, maybe has people waving to neighbors who they kind of never used to, that would be great.
Well, this is a great story, and well, I really want to say thank you for joining us on the BIN.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Well, her book is called There Goes the Neighborhood, an entertaining look at about gentrification and the issues kids are going through growing up after 2020. I'm Esther Dillard on the Black Information Network.